Hello, Simone. Today we are going to do a very statistics heavy episode on fertility rates. And it's going to be a collection of statistics to focus on just how bad the situation has gotten, with a
Mm.
lot coming from Zvi's Fertility Roundup #4,
I
but a
love his
lot
fertility roundups. Yes.
fantastic stuff, and a lot coming from random graphs and stuff like that that didn't find
Hmm.
a reason to fit into another episode. What
Okay.
we're going to find as we go through this is two overarching theses. One is the people who thought that this was going to level off this year, or we were going to begin to see signs of it slowing this year, were wrong. There is very little evidence that that is happening. But this is what the UN and the urban monoculture claims every year. Here, I'll put a graph on screen of the UN's yearly predicted fertility rates, in which you'll see as it's like going off a cliff in every country. And every year, the UN's like, this is the year it's just going to stabilize out of nowhere. So I think that we're seeing that narrative is being broken. And then the
Mhm.
other big thing that we're seeing is a reinforcement of what we have said from the beginning, is that culture is the only realistic way to fix this. And every solution that you attempt that is not cultural, whether it is making houses cheaper or making people earn more or even forcing one partner to live at home, is not going to resolve this issue. It's just going to make things worse,
Right.
which seen in the statistics, but what we'll see as viewers, we'll continue to see this in the statistics. So the first errant tweet here that I wanted to go over that I thought was really interesting, Z was commenting, the culture is all too eager to tell us that children or even marriage will make us miserable, when it is not even true if you discount the long term. The latest example of this, where there was a widely distributed claim in a new book that said married women are miserable because they report being unhappy when their spouse isn't around. But what the study actually meant by quote unquote spouse absent was no longer living with them, not stepped out of the room, which is the way he implied it. He's like, when a spouse isn't looking over their shoulders, they say that they're less happy. But what it really meant, when the spouse is dead, they're less happy.
Yeah, missing, presumed dead. Yeah, I'm probably less happy. Goodness gracious. Wow.
But I love that a lot of people, like, I actually remember when that stat was going around, and I was
Yeah.
like, that's pretty wild. That seems really out of line with what I've seen in my
I don't
life.
know, but what made it actually work and what made so many people misunderstand it is this implication that when the husband's back is turned, when he's out of earshot, suddenly people say wives say different things. It's exactly the trope that was pulled in that Ballerina Farms article that they later categorized as a hit piece, implying that when Hannah's husband left the room, wait, sorry, is her name Hannah? When the husband left the room, that she then talked about getting an epidural and then talked about how it was kind of awesome and it was just great. And then that there's this understanding that spouses will say very different things about their partners when their partners are not present. So yeah, I don't know. I can understand how people definitely believed that and were very credulous. But it's so, man, it's a case study in how this stuff can be used to mislead people. I hate it.
Yeah, so you are happier married, by the way. You know, these people are lying to you, but they need to have you believe. So much of this movement is just cope around, when I say this movement, I mean the parts of the urban monoculture which glorify a single lifestyle, cope around failing to secure a partner. Just as much as a lot of the incel movement is when they act like women are evil or like these demonic creatures destroying society. When, if you look at voting patterns, that just isn't true of married women. It might be single women are evil and destroying society, but married women are on team civilization. Okay. So, but actually, do you have any thoughts on that point, Simone?
On which point?
That this view that sort of the incel MGTOW parts of it movement have of women, that they are the force of evil that has created the urban monoculture and all these forces destroying society. And I just, if you look at statistics around married women, that's just not true. It's
Mm.
really this single woman urban monoculture minded person.
I just see these things as more systemic issues. And there are many elements of society that feel more feminized now, but that's not inherently the problem. It's just a symptom of a larger systemic problem that can't really be characterized by tropes.
Yeah. All right, so here is an interesting one. This is a tweet by Melissa Kearney. She says, the Social Security's actuaries are still bullish on the idea that US women are going to start having more babies than they've been having. Quote, birth rates are assumed to increase from recent very low levels to an ultimate level of 1.9 children per woman for 2040 and thereafter. Why? She says the trustees continue to assume that recent low birth rates of period fertility are in part indicative of a gradual shift towards older ages of childbearing for younger birth cohorts. Quote, Marco Jurek, when we say our core societal institutions are fragile and dysfunctional because they no longer suit the circumstances to which they were designed but cannot change, this is what we mean. And so here, what she's talking about is other people have pointed out that like institutions like the Social Security's actuaries were created during a time of stable fertility rates, and they just can't make the math work if they
Yeah.
actually show what's really happening. So they keep saying, oh, women are just choosing to have kids later, which we know from the data isn't true. And I'm going to put some graphs on screen here that show both what we're seeing, right? And so you can see the birth rates going down per generation. But here, if you look at the age of birth by the various age groups, which now I'm putting on stage here, what you're seeing is it is not moving later.
Yeah. No, and this is such a simple thing to think through. Someone sitting there looking at a massive spreadsheet or whatever and trying to model out things and needing to make the numbers work, because if you can't make the numbers work, people are going to get really mad and make a big fuss, and it's going to ruin your entire week because you just don't want to think about it that much. So you find a way to make the numbers work, and then you find a narrative to justify that. Anyone who's been involved in any kind of modeling has probably gone through that at some point, which makes me very dubious of almost all modeling, because I think it gives people this really false sense of security. Like, oh, in the models, it all works out. Can't you see this is the predicted trajectory of this company's performance or Social Security? And oh my gosh, people don't realize what thin ice we're on, right?
Yeah, and I think that it's not just about modeling, it's about who was in the urban cultural ecosystem permission to like blow the whistle on this, right? So like you work at you're a social security actuary, right? And you're doing your report for the year, and you could project what any rational person would project and then basically just submit a report that says, we're fucked, right? Like this isn't going to stay solvent. Do you culturally have permission to do something like that? Like as a social security actuary, do you have the permission to be the one to sort of wake up society and be like, but we're really screwed? And I don't feel like they actually have permission to be that person. That's something that needs to sort of be said from a position higher or within an administration that is going to be more favorable to that. Like if I was a social security actuary in the Trump administration, I'd be much more likely to be like, okay, fertility rates are actually a massive issue without worrying about my job. If you wrote that, I mean, they'd be fired, right?
Yeah. In the government, though, I can't imagine people getting fired for things like this. It's
Well,
just
what you're
not.
not seeing is what would happen. Okay, so imagine you do the actual Social Security's math, and a U.S. branch of the government, a fairly boring one, puts out a report that basically says we're fucked due to falling fertility rates.
Mhm.
That then becomes a media storm
Yes.
because all the right-wing media is going to jump on it. And how is the left-wing media going to reflexively react to that? They're going to reflexively say it's not true or they did the math wrong. They never.
Yeah, I guess they're gonna maybe scapegoat that person to say this person intentionally was negligent, and don't they realize well, of course then someone's going to retroactively figure out how to fudge the numbers to make them work and retroactively build a narrative as to why that's obviously true.
Yeah, and then they're
like,
going to have
there's going to be a rebound, this person didn't count for that.
in CNN, there's going to be all of these PhDs who come in, and the PhD is going to go up and say, well, this is how they did it wrong. And then they'll have a panel of PhDs all arguing. They all agree that one actually is an idiot.
Of course. Yeah.
But like maybe this is an issue we should at least have on the discussion board, which is so interesting to me that now that the issue is becoming more public, one of the things I always hear is, well, Malcolm and Simone were right about the whole fertility rate thing, but they're wrong in the way they've been presenting it. They've been going out there saying that only people like them should have kids, only tech elites should have kids. What we really need is a more like communitarian form of prenatalism that like involves everybody who's willing to participate in it. And it's like, that's what we've been doing from the beginning. You just don't want to admit that we were right from the very beginning about not just the message, but the way it was presented.
Yeah.
And to keep going, I thought this was an interesting point that was made. Your periodic reminder that we tax marriage, which also means we tax fertility. We do it less than we used to, but we still very much do it. When you tax something, you get less of it. Niskanen Center, the US tax code disproportionately discourages marriage among middle and low income. We need to fix this. They offer a variety of proposals. At the core of this is a basic set of arithmetic problems. It is not difficult to adjust the numbers such that it almost always is beneficial or at least neutral to be married, especially when there are children involved. So right now, it is not for middle and lower class individuals. Indeed, if we cannot do better, there is a very obvious solution. Raised base rates as needed to compensate, and then allow married couples to file as if they were unmarried. If they calculate that it is cheaper, end of penalty. And I really like that. Like, that's an easy, quick fix.
Yeah.
Married couples should be able to file as if they are unmarried. There is no logical reason in America why we should be taxing married couples more, especially low-income married couples more.
Well, no, this specifically disproportionately affects middle income. So low income, you get a benefit from marrying, and then high income, you get a benefit from marrying. But middle, you get the penalty. But again, it doesn't matter. You should get no penalty from marrying, because marrying in general seems to benefit society.
Well, in middle income is where we have the big fertility crash in America, especially among the American white population.
Yeah. There's the very inverted curve when it comes to income and fertility.
And I cannot imagine, like, if you want to talk about like the rot of the urban monoculture, that anyone isn't just like, this isn't a bipartisan issue to just get this off the books. I think shows, often I hear progressives and they're like, well, our party isn't actually doing the evil stuff. Like, that's just like what a few extremists are saying online. And I'm like, your party has literally made it so that married middle income people are taxed more than single ones. They really are pushing the urban monoculture in a way that's destructive to the individual, and that no logical argument other than distribution of the urban monoculture could further.
Yeah.
Also funny here, you could argue that this is aligned. We pointed out in our Why the Racist Left Trump video that a lot of the traditionalist right, who had like racialist or anti-gay marriage or anti-women messages, like, oh, you shouldn't, women are the cause of all evil, you shouldn't get married, anything like that. A lot of them turned against Trump right before the election, and were like, everybody needs to not vote for him or vote against him. And that they have mostly been pushed out of the right coalition, and that they should be leftist now. Because the left is structuring it in a way where no logical person would want to get married. So being so anti-marriage, seeing marriage as a trap that women have laid for men, should they not be supporting the Democrats at this point? I mean, with the 4Bs, you even have the celibate women and everything now. It's a perfect match. I can't hear you, by the way.
Sorry, Indy was making noises. Okay,
here I'm going to be reading an abstract from a paper, which I thought was pretty interesting. Children require care. The market for childcare has received much attention in recent years, as many countries considering subsidizing or supplying childcare as a response to dropping birth rates. However, the relationship between childcare markets and the fertility gap, the difference between the desired and achieved fertility, is yet to be explored. We build upon previous work by investigating the regulation of childcare and fertility gaps across the U.S. states. Our results consistently show fewer childcare regulations are associated with smaller fertility gaps. This suggests that women are better able to achieve their fertility goals in policy environments that allow for more flexibility in childcare options and lower costs. Your childcare regulations must be really harmful if parents are responding by having noticeably fewer children. This is as clear a message as you can get. Listen, the potential changes are big. And this isn't the abstract, this is Zvi extrapolating from the data in the extract. They estimate that if you shifted from the highest level of regulation, Connecticut, to the lowest, Louisiana, the total fertility rate, TFR, would rise from 1.51 to 1.7, or 13%. If every state moved to Louisiana's level, we would see a roughly 38% improvement, or a 5% increase in fertility.
Well, and probably the economy would be better off. People would be happier and better off too. Regulatory bloat, this isn't it amazing how regulatory bloat suppresses not just economic growth and building and infrastructure development and fixing things, but also literally human life. That it
Oh, it's
is
even worse
suppressing
if you
human life.
consider like the UK, right? Like
Mm.
I do love what you're saying here, right? Like this idea that regulatory bloat and bureaucracy is smothering of human potentiality, not just in our inventiveness, but in the very birth of more humans.
So sad. Oh gosh.
It's sad and damning, but I do think it is the inverse of vitalism, the vitalism that we need, and that's why it's so important, the job of institutions like Doge and stuff like that.
Yep.
I'd note how bad things probably are in the UK in regards to this. They have some of the worst childcare regulation in the world, with you essentially needing like a college, multiple people with like college type degrees overseeing children in daycare centers. Because
Well, you can't even have, for example, your neighbor watch your kids in the UK
Mhm.
because of regulation. You have to have some kind of certified professional watch your kids, which that imagine how unsustainable childcare is now. And this is, I think, a relatively new rule since the 90s, because there was some tragic and genuinely sad incident of a child being watched by a neighbor or something, or children being watched by a neighbor, and one of them died. But think of just the number of children now who will never exist because it is so
right.
unsustainably difficult to raise
And
kids in the UK now.
this brings me to something that we've said before, but I really need to pound home and make sure this is in our policy doc, by the way, Simone,
Mm,
is that any policy that is meant to protect children's lives need to weigh how many children don't exist because it was implemented.
mm,
So a policy doc that says something like, child seat certification, like X many children's lives will be saved by this, also needs to calculate the number of children who are functionally going to be killed because they don't come into existence.
That kid. But why?
They are replacements of people who had their existence consumed by denizens of the Crimson World.
It's the
mm.
same with regulation around caring for children. It's the same with any of that. Can you actually make a note to add that to our policy doc?
Yeah.
Because that's really powerful. And under one of our videos, if you have under 3 kids, you are definitionally a cuck because you're below replacement rate video, the top comment for a while, I don't know if it still is, but I found it really powerful. And it argued that we should see having 2 kids as having 0 kids, because that's slightly below replacement rate. Like having 2 kids in our society should be considered having slightly fewer than 0 kids. Having 1 kid is having -1 kid, and having 0 kids is having -2 kids. It's burdening society with your existence. And
Mhm.
that you really only get to, 1 kid or 2 kids once you are above the 2 kid mark. So when you have 3 kids, you have slightly less than 1 kid. When you have 2 kids, you have slightly less. When you have 4 kids, you have slightly less than 2 kids. And I think that conceptual framing difference is the way we will raise our children to think about kids.
Mm.
All right. Now I'm going to read a tweet by More Birth. You can see we're pulling from a huge diversity of sources here today. In this tweet, he says, "Did you think fertility couldn't get any lower than South Korea's seemingly impossible 0.72 births per woman in 2023? Macau is trending towards 0.49 births per woman in 2024. Lesson number 1, don't build like Macau if you want your country to have a future." By the way, More Birth thing, really like the guy. We had him over at our place just last weekend. Him and Robin Hanson and the woman who wrote Hannah's Children, we had them together and we chatted a
Catherine.
lot about fertility rates. Catherine. And his core bugaboo, in the same way that ours culture, is property prices and the way that you build. He really thinks that like tall buildings are suppressive of fertility. I just do not agree at all. Like, it clearly has an impact, but as, for example, Israel became more dense, their fertility rate also increased. Like, where you see high fertility cultures, they are just completely immune to this. So, like, why are we pretending that this is an issue? I don't know. That's my take on this.
Well, the bigger thing that we've discussed as well is solving housing policy is one of those things of like, yeah, and while we're at it, let's make nuclear energy pervasive, but it's not, this isn't an easy to solve problem, whereas reducing regulatory bloat is within our reach. It's a stretch goal, but it's feasible.
Well, same with cultural change. Like, cultural change at the family level, at the individual level, at the level
Is
of our
possible.
listeners, our
Yeah.
people, that's possible. And yeah. And then I'd also, Birth Gauge had tweeted, and this was in a retweet, new update. I guess we can forget any recovery this year for now. And it was a fertility rates by country. And you just see red across the board. I'll put it on screen here, but basically just across the board. All right. Now we're going to look at some things from Lyman Stone that Zvi brought up, which I thought were pretty interesting. So he says, I looked at the NLSY 1979 cohort. The housing data that's readily coded kind of sucks. It's basically metro versus non-metro to homeowner versus not live with parents, live on own, or GQB, but we can untangle some major indigeneity because NLSY gives us 1, fertility preferences surveyed before exit from parental household or adulthood, 2, sibling numbers, 3, childhood religious environment, all potentially huge confounds driving endogenous selection. So if we start with just housing related variables, this is what we get. Turns out more years in metro areas maybe boosts fertility, and more years as a homeowner reduces fertility. This is bizarre for me, but look at the effect of living with parents. Note, this graph is for men, not women, but they look similar. So really bizarrely here, what this shows is living in metros when you control for other things actually increases, not decreases fertility for a period of your life. And you and I lived in a metro for a period and then left. And I assume that that's what we're seeing here. As to why it would increase fertility, a lot of people can be like, well, how could that possibly make sense in the data?
I have a really instant intuition. What's yours?
It's very hard to find a partner outside of a city.
Exactly. Yeah. You find your partner in the city and then you get out as soon as you're ready to have kids.
So
you
it may turn out,
make money, find a partner.
That cities are actually critical to getting fertility rates back up because they're the only environment where there are lots of single young people around. And if you try to date in a rural area, you're just not going to find a partner.
Well, even keep in mind, like we talk about bringing back the London season. It was the London season. It existed because it was a time when Parliament was in session, the House of Lords was in session, and all these families happened to be in London at the same time, even though they typically lived in really dispersed rural manor houses and estates. Even in the past, cities really mattered when it came to matchmaking, and a transient time in a city was important for matchmaking. So that is really enlightening and helpful.
Well, yeah, and if a young person came to me and they're like, I have decided to avoid cities because, urban monoculture hellholes, how do I find a partner? I'd say, well, you're not going to. You need to go to a city. Like, that would be my advice.
If you don't
not
have
even
a partner at university or college, you have to find them at a city.
Yeah. I'd say basically, if you haven't found the person you plan to marry by the age of 25, you should be in oh shit territory and you should be grinding for it at that point. Like, that's like the point of a video game when you get stomped by a boss and you need to go in the woods and start grinding to get your level up. You are under leveled for life if you do not have the person who you are going to marry in front of you around the age of 25. And I think that our society right now, the heuristic that I would use for most young people is if you don't know who you're going to marry by the time you graduate college, you should be panicked.
Yep. Wait, by the time you graduate from college.
Graduate from college. Like, if you leave a college environment where you had tons of single people around your age, similar socioeconomic income, similar education level, and you were unable to secure a partner, you immediately need to be panicking at that point. You need to say, because it's going to get infinitely harder in the real world. And so if you weren't able to find one in that environment, it means that there was something systemically wrong with you or how you were trying to secure a partner.
Yeah.
And people can be like, but it's just so hard these days. It's like, it doesn't matter that it's hard these days, right? Like, it's like somebody comes to me and they're like, I'm a discriminated minority in my country. And they really are a discriminated minority in their country. And so I'm like, okay, well, then you have to work twice as hard. Or you have to work 3 times as hard. Or you have to work 4 times as hard for the same
Oh, and
outcome.
it takes a while. We had a friend who maybe 1 or 2 years, maybe even 2 years back, moved to Austin and was looking really, really hard for a partner. And now we just got word of the engagement, and that's great. And it's perfect. It
She
takes
was
a long time.
grinding for it, though.
Yes. And
This is
that's
an
the thing.
attractive, popular, semi-famous woman who has been grinding for a potential husband for years at this point. And I think that the young men who are like, oh, the women just aren't considering me, they're being delusional. They are being absolutely delusional. Actually, Brett Cooper did a thing on this recently where she's
really?
like, yeah, I know a lot of young women who are like, I want a male who's good to marry, and I can't think of a single young male that I would introduce them to. And Brett Cooper's a fairly based person, right? Like, you know, she's not like simping here for males. And it's the same with us. We know more females looking for husbands that we struggle to match than we know young men looking for wives that we struggle to match.
I don't know. I don't know.
You see it about equal, or?
I think it's equal. Yeah. And I think that for the most part, the biggest problem is a mixture of not trying hard enough and having unrealistic expectations, which is the worst combination you could possibly imagine. To both have incredibly high standards and not really be doing a high throughput. I mean, it's one thing if they're like, yeah, I'm dating at least one new person every single night of every single day of the year, doubling up on weekends, but I also have very high standards. I would say that they have a long battle to fight, but they can probably get something because they're being so prolific in their attempts. What I'm hearing from people now, though, is, oh, I have incredibly high expectations and, oh, maybe 3 dates a month. A month? I mean, you're not even going to find a 2 at that rate.
True. And I also go on to say here, I would say of the young males we know, at least. So of the males of this young generation right now, I don't know any that have made it to 30 and were seriously looking for someone to marry who haven't secured a partner. Typically, what I am finding is that young men that are serious about working to improve themselves, have a life plan, have their shit together, they're typically finding marriage partners that are really solid. I won't say that's true for every young woman I know, but I will say that's true for most young men I know who have their shit together. The ones who don't, I'm often embarrassed to tell them, like, you really don't have your shit together. You just are pretending like you have your shit together.
Aren't we all, though?
Not really. Anyway, so then he goes on to say, I have told you people repeatedly, this is the problem, and it remains today, in fact, the problem. The young people must have their own houses. So he's really against, because if you correct for things here, people living at home, right? Like, what's interesting, though, is if you correct for religion and siblings and everything like that, living with your parents is not that big an effect. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
But I think that this is not about getting young people houses. I think this is about changing cultural norms about having finding a partner when you're living with your parents. Like for our daughters, I would not hugely. Well, I don't know. Would I say like a guy basically doesn't have his shit together if he's still living with his parents? Depends on how rich the parents are. Depends on what he's doing with life. Yeah. I guess I'm kind of okay with the people still living with their parents being removed from the gene pool, even if it causes a major fertility crash.
It depends on the circumstances, in my opinion, but yeah, I think if someone is living with their parents but could immediately move out and live on their own, then it's a very different thing. Some people live with their parents just to really quickly pay off student debt, for example, or save up a lot of money to get a down payment on a house because it just makes more sense. And that makes sense. For example, if you have a job in the Bay Area and your parents live there, I could see, and I didn't do this, right? I got my own apartment in the Bay Area regardless, but I could see a lot of value in continuing to live with your parents so that you don't have to pay rent for an apartment in the Bay Area, to bide your time to either get something really good, maybe buy property, or just get a different job and leave California entirely, right? So there are reasons why I would be okay with it, but I would want to know that that person was capable of moving out immediately if they wanted to, and they were only living at home with their parents because it was financially responsible for some reason. Does that make sense?
So to continue, okay, but these are kind of dumb controls to be really savvy. We don't just want a control variable, we want an interaction. Say, does the effect of home ownership vary based on preferences? Yes, it does. This is for women with all other controls entered. For women who desire 0 or 1 child, so women with quite low preferences, 1 extra year of home ownership is associated with a considerable decline in fertility. But as desires rise, so does the effect. This kind of looks like home ownership is associated with a modest improvement in correspondence between desires and outcomes, at least for people at the extremes. I can tell you the same effect appears if I use metro status. More years spent in metro equals lower fertility for women with 0 to 1 desires, higher fertility to women with 3+ desires. On the whole, the results are a lot more favorable to density than I expected them to be, CC more births. That said, the measure here really are oblique. Quote, do you own a home, end quote, quote, are you in a metro area, end quote, do you live with your parents, end quote. None of these are quote unquote high density. So what you can see here is that owning your own home and the number of years you own your own home actually increasingly suppresses fertility for low fertility preference individuals, likely because it's increasing stability, but increases fertility for high fertility individuals. And it's the same with living in a metro area. Living in a metro area, it decreases fertility of your low fertility preference, but increases fertility of your high fertility preference, which again would align with what we're saying. Like people who have their shit together, it's just a higher standard of having your shit together is expected for this generation than previous generations. I think that's really what's going on here.
Yeah. Well, and I think living in a city with intention is like using psychedelics with intention, right? Like a lot of people can take psychedelics and have a weird trip and nothing really changes with their lives. And then other people can go into psychedelics with severe PTSD or other serious problems and come in with a really good plan and then really good therapy afterward and like come away a completely changed, better person with a more functional life. And I think cities are like that. You can just be in a city and kind of sit and rot in one, and it's an experience. It's the urban experience. Or you can go in with a plan and follow up and follow through and change, and then you get out and you're good. You're changed forever. You have your partner, you have your life together, you have your family, but you have to go into an urban area with intention and not just hedonism and a broad interest in maximizing your financial gain, which seems to be the default reason for entering a city.
I agree with that. Yeah. So to continue here, other times it's easier to identify. Alex Curtis, I just met a 72-year-old woman who's been telling me about her life. Best quote she said, you can either have a house and kids or you can fly first class. I want to fly first class. I find her inspiring.
Well, I
you
mean,
want to fly first class, Simone, but we never do. You take that as that's what we
yeah.
traded for kids.
Well, I understand that reasoning and I completely understand that mindset. But then when I think about it and I think about the percentage of my life that I spend on a plane every year versus the percentage of my life that I spend living every day, day to day, the typical routine, the percentage of time I spend on flights is not worth an entire, like, foregoing the most wonderful thing.
Yes. No, I mean, I think this is a really great framework because what could be more indolent millennial urban monoculture than wasting money on first class? It's such a transient, pointless, selfish thing. Very similar to climbing Everest, right? We have our video on that. That it is, I think, indicative of to say I cannot make indulgent, pointless expenditures if other people are relying on me. So I will choose to
Here's
deny
my
them a
thing.
right.
My argument for business class, it's a little different from Everest. Some people do just fly business class to flex, but I see it as akin to getting anesthesia during a medical procedure. Or maybe more similarly, getting nitrous oxide during like a dental procedure, right? You can get through it fine, uncomfortably, but fine without nitrous oxide. But with it, man, like you don't even remember it. It was it was just
Well, no,
fun.
I mean, it's what you're saying is I would pay anything. I would deny anyone in life the right to their
Just
life.
to avoid discomfort. Yeah. And which
Just
of
to avoid.
course isn't justified. But I'm just saying it's different from Everest. You're saying it was no, it's not an Everest thing. It's a hedonistic avoidance of discomfort and pain issue for many people, which I respect, but also if you're a little bit less myopic about your pain, which is difficult, I think, when you're in the urban monoculture because it's all about avoiding pain, you'll realize that the upside potential of the joy that family and children give to you and the meaning that your life gets and the extent to which actually on aggregate your pain and suffering and anxiety, especially with a larger family, just becomes such a small percentage of your mindscape because it's so full of everything else with your family that there's no room for the anxiety, there's no room for the discomfort, that it's a silly trade-off to even think about making. Of course it's better to have a family.
Well, it's something that you've talked about, which I find really interesting here, is also you would just not want to travel anymore because you've
Yeah.
entered a stage of your life where our home and our life is so high quality that you view leaving it even for vacation. And I feel the same way is nothing but work and a burden. But I think that that shows how our life is different from the life of the person who opts into the urban monoculture belief system.
Mm.
They find pleasure in taking a break from their lives, from getting in a plane, going somewhere else, and doing something other than what they've built for themselves. Whereas we would always take more pleasure from our day-to-day lives than we would from leaving them.
Mm. Yeah.
Anyway, back to the stats here. I'm going to put a graph on screen. And this is Lyman Stone here talking. OWD heads this section by saying, quote, fertility first falls within development and then rises with development. Building on this, UVA student Maxwell Trabrock argues that, quote, maximum progress can prevent declining fertility. If society advances enough, fertility will rise again. I mentioned Maxwell because I did a Twitter thread recently rebutting this piece. I did so because I was asked to do so by others, but ultimately Maxwell did an impressively good job of putting together the U-shaped argument in one specific place. Since writing the thread, I've had requests to formalize the argument a bit more. That's what this is, Lyman Stone. My basic thesis is this: the view that more growth will boost fertility again is wrong. It is based on seriously outdated underlying research, doesn't fit the actual empirical facts of the case well, and it leads to theoretical confusion, which inhibits clear understanding of how fertility actually works. And I agree with that. You just don't see this. You cannot develop your way out of this issue unless you have AIs creating and raising kids. Any sane person would know that. Like if you look at your ultra developed, ultra urban monoculture friends, these groups' fertility rates is like 0.2. Like it's so astonishingly low. Having even 2 kids is considered quite a lot by some of these groups. So then he goes on to say, so do we have evidence on lifetime disposable income? Yes, we do, from Sweden. Fertility rises with men's income and has basically forever. Meanwhile, women's incomes are pretty much totally unrelated to fertility. Whoopsie, and women's earnings are negatively related to fertility. And I'll put some graphs on screen here. By the way, this is Lyman Stone. So just so people know, and we've pointed this out before, Lyman Stone heavily biases anything he's looking at to try to argue that it's a really weird thing. It's like being a flat earther of the pronatalist movement, that low income doesn't lead to higher fertility and that high income generally doesn't lead to lower fertility. And if you look here, he had to find like one obscure country where this is the case, Sweden, to make this point. But he's about to pull out some data which makes our point, which is that culture is everything, which I'll get to in a second. So every kind of income is pronatal except for women's wages. Women's interest income, business income, and rental income, welfare income, support from husband or family, all probably pronatal. Earnings, no. That's really interesting. So women getting income from nothing or from not working, he argues is increasing fertility rate. I think that's because he likes the idea of women living at home. He really likes this traditional
Oh, for
Christian.
sure. Yeah.
And that's what he's trying to argue, even though he doesn't have any data that supports this. Actually, the data supports the opposite. When women win the lottery, their fertility went down, and this would be equivalent to, like rental income, business income, welfare income. Like it's a
Mm.
random cash deposit. We also know from the big study on cash handouts that was done on universal basic income didn't increase female fertility. So he's just making something up here, I guess. Earnings, no. On the other hand, you might look at the nearly universal rule of species that status predicts reproductive success. You might look at the stable male earnings fertility gradient and suppose that high income will usually predict high fertility. This is my view. High income will usually predict high fertility, except it doesn't in most countries. That he had to choose Sweden to make this work is really, I think, sort of the exception that proves the rule. So just so people understand how insane the statement, you might look at stable male earning fertility gradient and suppose that high income would usually support high fertility. This is my view. High income will usually predict high fertility is. Just look at these charts here, right? This is between country fertility rates. This is within country fertility rates. Almost no matter how you slice it, lower income, and this is between and within countries, is predictive of higher fertility rate. But then he goes on to say, which I think is interesting here, is the relation between income and fertility is culturally determined. Income has a relation with fertility, but it's not income to fertility, either up or down. It's income times culture to fertility.
Mhm.
Okay, I do agree with this.
Yeah.
The problem is that the dominant culture on Earth, the urban monoculture, has a negative number attached to that culture times income to fertility outcome, which means that the only way to fight it is with cultures other than the dominant culture, which means it's culture, silly. Any thoughts before I move forward there?
No, the answer here is it's the culture, stupid.
It's the culture, stupid. Yeah. And so here we're back to Zvi again. Perhaps one could say that income relative to expectations or societal positions predict individual fertility. That seems like an actual mechanism. As you get higher income, perhaps excluding female labor income because of the substitution problem, relative to the perceived financial cost of children, you get more children. The problem is that if rising income also raises perceived costs more, you go backwards, as it does in the urban monoculture. This is really interesting because the urban monoculture is at its core like a consumerist culture. As you get more income, it's always going to say that the first thing that you should be spending it on is signaling class status instead of anything like genuinely meaningful. And so it's going to lower the fertility rate because you're going to be more interested in signaling class status. Her core argument is that what we actually have here is Simpson's paradox. That what's going on is the compositional changes in income cohorts are creating a U-shaped curve that isn't a good way of understanding the situation. And here I am putting some graphs on screen here where I think what we can really see the answer from this final graph, which is like a graph I always wish it existed, and I'm glad we have it here. What this graph shows is the U-shaped curve of fertility rates, where you see them going up again at high levels of income, but it shows the population size of each one of these incomes as well. And you see that basically no one exists within the level of wealth you need for that to increase fertility rate, and that is above $500,000 to $1 million a year in household income. Now, here's something that's really interesting. If we're talking about Korea that I didn't know,
Hmm.
because Korea is very low fertility, and we often talk about saving Korean culture and everything like that. It's that Korean culture, for whatever reason, makes large businesses more productive than they should be, and small businesses less productive than they should be. They are a chaebol culture. Chaebols are these giant megacorps that are in Korea, where like you'll live in like a Samsung apartment with a Samsung fridge and a Samsung computer and a Samsung internet connection that makes Samsung boats. It's weird and dystopian if you've ever lived there from the perspective.
Oh, it's kind of cool. But yeah, sure.
It is kind of cool. I feel very much like I'm in like Akira or something whenever I'm there. I'm like,
I love
oh,
it. It's so
I
it's so
have to put my Samson card to open the door for my Samson building, and
yeah,
they're tracking me all the time.
so great.
But anyway, so here it says, while small to medium-sized businesses are rarely as productive as large ones, it's striking how unproductive South Korea's small businesses are compared to those in Western nations. The OECD, for example, found small service sector firms in Korea are 30% as productive as larger firms with over 250 workers. In the Netherlands and Germany, it is 84 to 90% respectively. Similarly, the Asian Development Bank found that in 2010, small Korean firms with 5 to 49 workers were 22% as productive as firms with over 200 workers. So in
Mm.
most countries, it's like a 20% or 10% hit in productivity. In Korea, it's like an 80 or 90% hit to productivity. And I think this culturally shows how much Korea is optimized for both collectivism and to work in these giant firms, which is interesting to me. And I think that there's probably something to that that we'll probably dig deeper in the next time we look at Korean fertility statistics.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, so next, here we are looking at a list of wealthy people's names. And this person, Matthew Iglesias, is saying small sample, but at the top end, but Larry Ellison and Larry Page each have 2 kids. Zuckerberg, Gates, Buffett, Ballmer, and Brin each have 3. Bezos has 4, Arnold has 5, and Musk has 7. And they're talking about the wealthiest people in the world right now, or in the US, I suppose. I would see this is really bad. You should not live in a society where a number of the wealthiest people only have 2 children. That basically means they're aiming for what's normative. I would go so far as to say that if you are at the level of hundreds of billions of dollars wealth, that you should probably have multiple wives.
Well, one, that's not legal in the United States. I think it would be
Musk
very
functionally does.
He does. And there are other people in society who are proudly advertising the fact that they have multiple not wives, women who are pregnant with their children. Just sent us that tweet from
What
someone,
was this tweet?
some rapper who is very proud about the fact that he has like 6 women concurrently pregnant.
I wouldn't imagine the effects of that are going to be entirely genetically positive.
It's just not sustainable in the same way. Like I get it. Historically, yes, very resourced men have typically had a lot of children, either very publicly or privately. You know, kings of England and France had all these bastard children, for example, who were recognized with varying degrees of
But they
formality.
weren't they were not they had no genetic advantage over their, like, they may have from some sort of historical reason, but it's
Mhm.
not like they competed in a meritocracy and ended up on top.
Yeah. Yeah,
Here's
I
what I suspect is gonna happen.
okay.
I suspect that the moment we get artificial wombs working
Mhm.
really well, we will have some billionaires begin to just mass produce children,
Yeah.
mass educate them, mass give them nurturing. So you'll have some that's producing like 20 kids per year or something like that. This is something where if somebody did that and they were looking for somebody to run this facility, that is my dream job. So let me know. I will make sure very few of these kids end up totally messed up.
Oh my god. I don't know. I think that there are some people who just from an ideological perspective want to spam children, but that most of the billionaires who have larger families, or not even like anyone, people of any level of wealth, do it because they love their children and they want to give their children a good life and they like spending time with their kids. And when you change it to
It's a
this
horrible
industrial
reason to have
scale,
kids. A horror. You don't kids aren't pets. You don't have them because of how they
yeah, they're not pets. They're humans. They're people. You're bringing full
no,
people
but the
into the
point
world,
I'm
and they
making is
deserve.
you shouldn't have kids because of the emotional states they generate in yourself.
No,
If
but
you
you
have
should
kids,
be because you're willing to commit to raising and bringing a new person into the world. And yes, very, very well resourced people can do that by bringing in a ton of staff and stuff. It's just that after a while, it becomes so abstracted from you personally that I kind of feel like you're missing the point. I think that there's a
I
sweet spot
strongly
with
disagree
people.
here. So consider my childhood, right? I
Uh-huh.
spent very little time with my parents. I spent a lot of time being raised by maids and stuff like that.
You still spent
I
a lot of very formative experiences with them. And if you had 50 siblings, you would not have had that. No, you have been
oh,
very
this
shaped
is
by formative
this
experiences
is
with your parents.
you have been gaslit by my parents a little bit here, who have not presented an
I've
entirely
seen your
accurate.
home videos. I mean, you've had enough to have formative
This
experiences.
is exactly what I'm talking about gaslighting, Simone. Home videos can be chosen for the maybe a few hours a year I would have spent around my parents. I have read about the amount of time that Elon spends with his kids. I absolutely guarantee you that on average, Elon is spending twice as much time with any of his kids as my parents spent with me in my
And
childhood.
my point is that he has about the right number of kids. I think he has 11 kids, right? And I think that's about the right number. I think that
No, the point I'm
somewhere
making, which I don't think you're okay, if he spends twice the amount of time with his kids as my parents spent with me,
uh-huh.
right? And I grew up very much seeing my parents as my parents.
Mhm.
My parents is the culture that I'm taking my life from. I don't even remember the names of some of the maids who spent years.
So you're
No,
saying
the point that you're missing is that the kids' brains are biologically coded to know who their parents are among the caregivers and
Mhm.
culturally code to them.
Hmm. Yeah, roughly I agree with you. So you're indicating that a number between 10 and 30 is optimal. No, I mean you're really
No, I'm
implying
not
though
arguing that.
you think
I'm
it's like
arguing that
100, you think it's 200. That just
you can
doesn't
easily get
seem.
to 100 or 500 in the age of
I
AI, where we
There are
can have
various
AI.
reasons why I don't like that. I don't like the lack of genetic diversity in that. I think that we're better off.
Simone, in society, if 1 billionaire had literally 10,000 kids, it would do nothing to Earth's genetic diversity. Literally zero. He wouldn't even be 0.0000001% of Earth's population.
Right, but
Like,
we're not talking about that. We're talking about ultimately if artificial wombs became widely available, there would be 250 billionaires who are doing that. And then suddenly there's this
even if
non-trivial
there
percentage of
were.
the future population that.
No, it is a trivial. Do the math. This is something that people don't do when they make this genetics argument, is they literally they're like, hypothetically, that means 50% of the next population could all be a handful of people's kids. And I'm like, no, even if every billionaire on Earth was doing this, it would still be under 0.01% of Earth's future population. Like, you're not running the actual numbers in your head here, Simone. It would be completely trivial. And keep in mind that by the time it became an issue, we would have genetic engineering to fix any potential issues that this was causing. Even if it became an issue, which it very is unlikely to become an issue. And in addition to that, this next generation, like when this is happening, this is when they'll be able to train AIs on books. Like if somebody wanted to train an AI on you and me, for example, given the amount of content we put out there, that AI would probably be within like 10 to 5% of being able to replicate our answers, our parenting style in terms of how it interacted with a kid, just due to the sheer volume of information on us. The idea that you cannot clone a parent anymore is just factually wrong.
Can't you just leave the child with Huggy?
Stop calling him the child, Richard! His name is Rocket, and I'm not leaving him with your crappy robot!
Sally! Why, that's almost churlish.
You can't replace family with a robot, Richard! We need real human affection!
That's why Huggy's programmed to simulate its sweetness. Yes. Perhaps the fresh air will, calm the female, real human affection. Perhaps a pill or a burst of gamma radiation.
Yeah, I mean maybe this is just intuitively not what feels right for me, and I respect that. Sometimes logic is just not in concordance with someone's intuition and feelings,
How
and
would we feel if one of our kids ended up doing this?
and one of our kids ended up I would talk with them about it. I would.
You would try to dissuade them from having more kids the same way my mom did with me.
No, because your mom was all about putting in resources that I don't think really mattered. I mean, this is so against everything that I stand for aesthetically. So I think you can understand that I'm not fronting here, but I really think that children deserve a lot of very warm love and care and unique mental space of a parent. And when you have 50 plus children, the fraction of them, like you're going to start having trouble keeping track of who's who and what their names are and what their favorite colors are. And I just feel like if you're going to bring someone into the world, they are entitled to a certain proportion, not just of your wealth, not just of your resources, but also of your mindscape. And maybe this is the difference between men and women. I mean, obviously, you evolutionarily, as a male, have been programmed on a very deep level to spam and to just not give a shit. Like you are just designed to have as many kids as possible and genuinely not care. Whereas I have been, evolved to be very careful about the quality and resources that each kid can be given, because typically it's the women who are left with the kids and it's the men who walk away. So I understand why you have the mindset that you do and why none of
I
this
get
seems to
what
be
you're
repugnant
saying.
to you.
I might have a genetic predilection to this mindset, but I think that you're being overly sentimental and mythologizing the role of the parent when a lot of this parental love can be simulated.
You can't replace family with a robot, Richard. We need real human affection.
That's why Huggy's programmed to simulate it, sweetness.
This one is from Laura Lefebvre. French
Well, no, I
fertility
have to ask you, like, would you be willing to, I don't know, like look one of our kids, our living kids now in the face and say, like, hey, I'm now going to send you to a facility and you're largely going to be raised by other people. And, we're not going to live our life together anymore. And, you're going to have.
Do you have any idea what my childhood was like? I was taken away from my parents at around the age of 12, stopped living with them.
Yeah.
After that, I never lived with them again. I first lived in a prison system complex thing. Then
Yes.
I lived at a pre-preparatory boarding school for middle
And you're
school.
saying that was ideal?
Yes, it was better than I know. I know all the other kids of rich people in my neighborhood. All of them are drug addicts. They're OD'd. They're wasteful.
Yeah, as are many of the kids that you went to all these facilities and schools with. So
fewer of them.
Really?
Yes.
Because how many of your classmates are thriving right now?
Well, not many people are like me, Simone. What I will say is my genetics does well in hardship environments. And I'd point out here that this childhood that she is terrified of one of our kids potentially facing is the childhood that created me, the person who presumably, like, I love who I am and she seems to like who I am. I would be really happy if my kids ended up like me. And even if all of the hardship was a negative, even if I maybe could have been a better person without it, I still would choose existence plus hardship over non-existence. And if through sending kids to a facility, I was able to bring more humans into existence, of course, are you willing to look at those additional kids in the face and say, sorry, I wasn't willing to bring you into existence because your brother's at a facility? Functionally, those kids are up in heaven waiting on us to have them, and you're just leaving them hanging. No, this isn't cosmologically how I think things work, but functionally it's how things work because you're denying a human a right to exist.
What kind of dance should I do first for Mom and Dad? Something classical? Or cha-cha?
From what I've heard, it's going to take a while to even learn how to walk.
So, maybe just a twist then?
And I would be very, and keep in mind, when I was told this as a kid, I wasn't told this like a bad thing. It's like, oh, you get to go into an environment where things are harder and you have more self-determination. A kid, especially one of our kids, would love that. If you don't frame it as some like negative, oh, you are going to be away from mommy's hugs, and you're like, all right, buddy, now you're turning 8. the game gets harder. Like kids are like, oh yeah, let's do it. Like you're gonna have to fend for yourself. Oh, when I'm fending for myself, I'm gonna do 10 times as good as when mommy and daddy are fending for me. You know, that is the mindset I went into all this with. And I look at our kids and I know our kids. Like if you're saying our actual kids, they'd effing love this. In fact, I remember like just the other day, our kids were playing and Octavian took me aside and he goes, Daddy, I need you to go in the other room and look at the computer. And I was like, what? And he goes, the little ones are playing. I need you to go look at a computer. Because he knows what's up. They were having fun, and me being around was lowering their ability to play. So I disagree.
You make valid arguments. Maybe it's just inbuilt to my
Well, I
like
mean, you're a single
biological
child, right? So you're
matter.
like hyper on this side.
I was an only child, yeah, and I loved being an only child, and I loved having a close relationship with my parents, and I love my parents, and I also just have this deep inbuilt intuition, and maybe this happened after I had kids, where just I really think kids deserve. And I am not someone to say that anyone is entitled to anything, right? But I still think that if you're going to bring a person into the world, they are entitled to like a minimal percentage of your overall mental state.
Think about Octavian, our oldest kid, our most cognitive kid. If you asked him, Simone, would you prefer more brothers and sisters or more time with mommy and daddy? What is he going to answer?
We can ask him tonight.
Okay. I know it's more brothers and sisters. You know it's more brothers and sisters. You don't even have to ask, but we will. All right, so I'm gonna keep going here. So Laura Lefender says French fertility rates top the ratings in Europe, not so much for reasons of immigration, but rather because fertility among native-born women is high. And so here you can look at native-born versus all women in the country, and what you see, and what we've always said, is that diversity in a country, and there's this one study that argues against this, but it's like obviously not true if you look at the data. Like it's so weird to me that people can't tell when people are lying to them with data. I'm like, okay, what countries have the highest fertility rates? You're looking at like France and the United States and Israel, fairly diverse countries. Which countries have the lowest fertility rates? Countries like Korea and China. And it's like, okay, well, it's clearly diversity, especially competitive diversity, is good for fertility rates, which again, we're finding in the data here. Now, I thought this was interesting to understand the cult of the host. So this is talking about Japan and host clubs. This was tweeted by Jordan Schneider. We have to start with two statistics. Oh, sorry, if you don't know what a host club is, it's a place where women in Japan go to pretend to sort of date guys. Like they buy
host clubs are basically bars or nightclubs in Japan staffed by attractive male boyfriend experience type people. You select one when you get there, and then one or two, it's, you know, like maybe one per person, and then sit there and drink with them. And they make money from the drinks that you purchase. And then after that, they may even like continue texting you and, you know, asking you to come back. And that's kind of how they make money. And that they're a really interesting phenomenon. And you should definitely watch some YouTube videos summarizing this economy, because it's crazy. Some women even end up going into sex work because they are trying to support the
addiction to their fake boyfriend.
Yeah, they'll quit their job and they'll go into sex work to support their addiction to their fake boyfriend, who works at basically also in sex work, but just basically the female equivalent of it, which is more of a relationship style experience. It's crazy.
It is crazy. And that it's culturally normalized, I think, is really negative as well.
Yes.
Because this provides a way to masturbate sort of the boyfriend desire that many Japanese women have.
Yeah.
Although I imagine that host clubs are going to take a major hit as chat AIs get more popular.
I could see that. Yes. I could also see the government banning them.
They probably should, to be honest.
They should.
A lot of women are going to be angry, but they probably should.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, so this is somebody would be like, why would you not say that porn should be banned then? Because there's like no statistics that shows that porn lowers birth rates. Actually, anything, if you look at the statistics in the countries where porn is banned, porn seems to...
A woman is very unlikely to be going through the grind of dating and finding a husband if she's going to host clubs.
And this is
That's the problem.
not true of men in porn. Despite
Yeah,
what
well,
people
it's not
tell
true of women in porn. Women can read romance novels and still actively be dating. But if you are investing in a host club relationship, you do not have money or time to date. You can only spend your evenings and money on supporting this host club relationship, which is just it's so toxic. So I typically am not for banning anything, but I don't really see anyone benefiting from this.
Yeah.
Even the men who work in host clubs are paying huge commissions to the club owner for all the alcohol purchase. They're not being paid directly. They're being essentially paid a commission on drinks purchased at the bar. It's stupid.
Yeah. More than 60% of the Japanese women in their late 20s are unmarried, double the rate in the mid 1980s. A recent study found that more than a third of unmarried Japanese adults, 20 to 24, have never dated.
Oh, yikes. Ouch.
That is wild. So when you consider that 60% are unmarried of women at that age range, and a third of them, more than a third of them, have never even dated, this makes a lot of sense. There's just not a cultural system that is pressuring them to go out and interact with guys, and they don't feel the need to do this. They do not think guys have anything to offer.
Right.
And I think that this is something that a lot of guys in the West haven't gotten yet. If you increase this narrative of women evil, it can get to a point where women just decide in mass, I'm not even going to try anymore.
Yeah.
Because that's what happened in Korea and Japan.
Yes. Well, Japan's doing relatively quite well in East Asia. I don't think it's as bad in Japan, but in Korea, certainly it is. And this people talk about the 4Bs movement and misogyny being really stuff that is only very serious among extremists. But I do think that there is a trickle-down effect, that it sort of rubs off and gives people a general bad taste of the other sex because of these very high-profile battles taking place amongst extremists on each side. So just because you yourself are not part of the 4Bs movement, if you're a woman in Korea, you might still be like women and men hate each other here, right? This isn't really a place for me to get married. I shouldn't really be investing in dating because it's not really great for women, right? It's just not a good overall scheme. On one note, Malcolm, that in 4 minutes I have to jump on that call.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about splitting this into 2 episodes, so I am totally okay with that.
Okay.
Yes, so people are commenting on how the conservatives, now that they've won, are beginning to split and fight amongst themselves a bit more. And one of the big areas, which I think we've even seen, is really the losers of the conservative movement, the traditionalists, the ones who really want to go back to the old ways of doing things. They've gotten quite mad about this Stacey Wojak meme, who just acts like a normal wife, demands things of her husband, sometimes makes mistakes, stuff like that.
Okay.
And they're like, oh, this is super relatable. And they're like, oh, you guys are owning yourselves, and women should always serve their husband and not make any mistakes as a wife. And you're just looking really cucked right here. And all the normal, actually married men are this is the way most married women are. What are you doing? And it sort of devolved into this. It was one faction apparently sort of being led by Nick Fuentes, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, you can talk a lot about how a woman should act as a wife if you're not dating anyone, because then you can say, well, this is the ideal wife, and I should only continue civilization if I can find this idealized wife. And it's created a huge problem for people. I think we should do an episode on it, but it's a little too similar to our Don't Trust Influencers Without Parents episode, which hasn't gone which hasn't gone live yet.
Too similar. You can maybe add some annotation to it though about this.
Anyway. One, two, good.